Thank you for joining us for our next episode of our small group study where we're going over the New Testament. And Chad, would you read our scripture for us about Jesus' cleansing of the temple?
Yeah, so in John chapter 2, starting in verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me."
When we look at this passage, it's one of the, I think, passages that is often when you see a popular depiction of Jesus, especially from the point of view of non-believers. This is not a passage that's often referred to or known because it shows Jesus in a much different light than the way that Jesus is often portrayed as a pacifistic kind of almost a monkish type person who kind of serenely walks around and tells people to feel good about themselves. And this shows Jesus in a much different light. How do we reconcile this view of Jesus to what the popular view of Jesus is?
Well, I don't know that we can reconcile this view or the real view of Jesus with the popular view of Jesus. Jesus isn't this soft pacifist in every case and stuff like that. And don't get me wrong, obviously, I think this goes back to that same issue of like people view the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament differently and stuff like this. But here Jesus looks much more reminiscent of, say, the God we encounter in the Old Testament than the one we encounter in popular culture.
One of the things that C.S. Lewis is famous for is his trilemma, where he says that Jesus isn't, this nice, moral teacher. He's either a liar or a lunatic or he's Lord. I believe that this is one of those instances that really brings this trilemma into focus. Why would C.S. Lewis say this, and how does that relate to what Jesus is doing here?
Oddly enough, we're on the same page because I was thinking the exact same thing about C.S. Lewis' trilemma here. But liar, lunatic, or Lord, and it's one of those things. If you think you're God, if you're not, you're either a liar or you're crazy, or the last conclusion in the case of Jesus that we come to here is that he really is God, and you must submit and call him Lord. That's kind of the nature of the trilemma. And so, if Jesus really is God here and he's cleansing out the temple, we're going to have to either let our popular conception of who Jesus is die and let the real Jesus live, or we're just going to have to chalk it up that, this is just not true.
It seems to me that Jesus here is showing a certain amount of authority over an area that it's quite conceited to try to claim authority over if you're not who you say you are. If Jesus isn't Lord, then his claim of authority to have authority over the temple is a pretty radical and egotistical move on his part. Now, when we look at this, we want to understand, well, why is Jesus doing this? Do you get up on the wrong side of the bed, or how does this fit into this action of cleaning the temple? How does this fit into the overall arc of Scripture? What's happening here?
Yeah, I guess you could see both a little bit of him fulfilling both his priestly and kingly roles at the same time, maybe. And priestly, obviously, cleansing the temple and making sure the temple is fitting the design God made it for, but also kingly and kind of enforcing the rules, if you will. And obviously it says, zeal for your house will consume me. It's quoting the Old Testament and stuff like this, but you'll hear some commentators talk about this, how the money changers here and stuff like that were also kind of not just dishonoring the temple and stuff like that, but also taking advantage of the people, not being the greatest of shepherds and things of this sort. And Jesus is there to turn this right and make the temple exactly what God designed it to be.
Many theologians will point out that there were rules for leprosy in the Old Testament, and there's a very strange rule about house leprosy. That not only a human being could get leprosy, but also a dwelling place, a house could get leprosy. And it's a very weird passage, and we don't know of any instance where somebody found their house to be leprous. There's no examples of that in Scripture. But some theologians will point to this as a picture of house leprosy. How does that fit into, or what's that all about?
So I believe that rule is the priest is supposed to come and examine the house that has leprosy and stuff like this, and then come in and examine it a second time. And upon examining it the second time, if it is still found leprous, I think they're supposed to destroy it and things of the sort. And Jesus coming to the temple here, this is the account where he comes early in his ministry, but it comes once again late in the ministry, and if it's still found leprous, so to speak, unclean, it's supposed to be destroyed. And obviously we have record that it was destroyed in 70 AD.
Okay. And so what is leprosy, and how would that apply to what's happening here in the temple?
So leprosy, I mean, it's not simply what we would call leprosy today, right? It's kind of more of a suite of conditions and diseases and stuff like this, but it had a very spiritual meaning of uncleanness and things of this sort. And so in a spiritual sense, to say that the temple is unclean, it's one of those things that leprosy was supposed to ostracize you from the community and from God. And for the temple, which is where God is supposed to dwell, to itself be unclean, kind of the epitome of a place that's, if any place on earth physically was supposed to be clean and fit for God's presence, it was supposed to be the temple. So for that not to be the case, it's no surprise Jesus takes great offense.
Okay. And one of the things that we want to look at in this is what is it that the temple represents, and how does that fit into the bigger picture of Jesus' ministry? It's instructive to us that Jesus is doing this, this is kind of the first act of his ministry in a sense. What is it about what the temple represents that is making this a good inaugural move for Jesus in kind of starting his public ministry?
I don't know if this is what you're alluding to, but the temple and the tabernacle were kind of multivalent symbols and stuff like this. And in one case, they represented Jesus himself. In another case, they represented the believer. And obviously, both being cleansed at the beginning of their ministry, especially in the case of the believer, this is the way it's supposed to work, right? You place your faith in Jesus. You are justified through the atonement and cleansed via baptism, if you will, in a symbolic way, and maybe more than that. I don't want to say it's merely symbolic, but and that's kind of how you start your life as a believer. So I don't know if you're really referring to the symbol as it's kind of representing Jesus or the believer or both,
or even the people of God. There's a sense in which the temple is the meeting place between God and man, and that happens in Jesus. It happens in us as believers, but it's also a picture of the whole people of God, and I find it interesting that Jesus' ministry here among the people of God is being kicked off by him going and cleansing the temple, which represents the people of God. So he's kind of doing symbolically what he's going to be doing in actuality here momentarily. What is it about what is happening that is so unclean? Whether we look at this as house leprosy or we look at it as symbolic of the people, this is a very unusual act for Jesus. What is it about what's going on that's so unclean that it moves Jesus to do what he's doing?
I guess at the root of it might be not treating God as holy. For somebody as esteemed as Moses, this was the great sin for Moses, was not treating God as holy before the people. And so I don't know if that's quite right, but it might be that if the temple where God is supposed to dwell is unclean, and obviously the hearts of the people are unclean, which is the true temple in the New Testament, right? And just not honoring God and treating him as holy as he should be.
Right. There's a sense in which you can see that if this temple is representing really the relationship between God and his people, and if that's being used as a means of profit, that it's no longer the honoring of God that's being sought here, but the honoring of ourselves. And there's a sense in which you can see that if that's what's going on, if that's what this is truly symbolizing, that there's no really greater issue for Jesus to be dealing with. This is as bad as things could possibly be from the perspective of Jesus.